A black man storms into the ER, clutching a seizing child. No ID, no insurance, just raw panic. The staff rushes forward, but the doctor on call stops cold. It's her, the woman who disappeared from his life 7 years ago, without a goodbye. In that instant, the past and present collide. Neither of them knows yet. This child links them in a way that will unravel everything they thought they left behind. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? It was the kind of silence that only lives in the early hours when the world feels paused and the streets are so still you could hear a dog's collar jingle 2 blocks away. Inside a small one-bedroom home tucked behind a row of shuttered shops, Paul Bennett was jolted awake by a sound no parent ever wants to hear, the sharp, shallow gasps of a child struggling to breathe. He was on his feet before he was fully conscious, already moving down the narrow hallway. The sound was coming from Joseph's room. Joseph, 5 years old, was lying on his side body, stiff limbs, twitching eyes, unfocused. His small frame convulsed against the thin mattress, and his breath came in short, erratic spurts. Paul dropped to his knees, heart pounding, trying to remember what to do. He cradled Joseph's head carefully, keeping him turned to the side, murmuring his name. But the boy didn't respond. Paul's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, only to remember it had died the night before. He grabbed his jacket, scooped Joseph into his arms, and stepped out into the street without thinking. It was pitch black outside, the kind of darkness that made everything feel farther away. There was no car. Paul had sold his pickup last winter to cover hospital bills. He didn't have insurance. What he had now was a dying child in his arms and the barest hope that anyone would answer their door. He sprinted toward the nearest house with lights on. It belonged to Maria Ortega, a widow in her late 60s, who had lived next door for more than a decade. He knocked hard, louder than he meant to, then knocked again. There was a movement inside, a flicker behind the curtain, then silence. He could hear his own breathing, ragged, the weight of Joseph pressing against his chest. The door opened a crack. Maria stood there in a robe, hair in curlers, eyes narrowed. Her gaze moved from Paul's face to the boy in his arms. Her hand hovered on the doorknob, uncertain. It was subtle, but it was there, the pause, the flicker of doubt. Paul recognized it. "I need help," Paul said. His voice was hoarse, urgent. "He's having a seizure. Please, I don't have a car." Maria hesitated, then looked at Joseph again. The boy's face was pale, his lips slightly blue. She opened the door wider. "Get in," she said, already turning to grab her car keys from the side table. The drive to the hospital was quiet except for the hum of the engine and Joseph's shallow breathing. Maria didn't ask questions. She just drove her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Paul sat in the back seat, cradling Joseph close, whispering his name, trying not to let panic take over. He could feel the boy's skin growing colder, every second stretched into forever. When they arrived, Maria pulled up to the emergency entrance. Paul didn't wait for help. He ran inside, carrying Joseph, his voice breaking as he shouted for a nurse. The woman at the desk looked up surprised, then motioned for a team to come forward. "He needs help," Paul shouted. "He's 5 years old. He's been seizing for over 10 minutes. The nurses took Joseph from his arms and rushed him down the corridor. Paul started to follow, but a security guard stepped in front of him. "Sir, I need you to wait here." The man said, his tone firm but not unkind. "He's my son," Paul protested. The guard nodded slowly. "I understand, but we need to verify his information first." Paul's heart dropped. "I don't have his insurance card. We've been to this hospital before. His name is Joseph Collins. I'm Paul Bennett. I've raised him since he was 2. The guard exchanged a glance with the woman at the front desk. She began typing. Paul stood there, breathing hard, sweat soaking through his shirt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He looked down the hallway where they'd taken Joseph. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything. Just the low murmur of voices behind closed doors, the occasional beep of a monitor. A nurse approached. She looked young, maybe late 20s, but her eyes were steady. "Sir," she said gently, "they're working on him now. We'll let you know as soon as we can." Paul nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. He sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs along the wall. The hallway was cold, too bright, and empty in all the wrong ways. He rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. For a few moments, there was nothing. Just silence except for the faint sound of wheels rolling across the floor. Then came the memories, Joseph's laugh when he learned to ride a bike, the way he'd cling to Paul's shirt when he was scared, how he always wanted 2 bedtime stories instead of 1. Paul had never planned to be a father. He didn't even remember saying yes to Jenna that day she showed up with Joseph in tow. But somehow, over time, love had done what permission couldn't. It rooted itself. He looked up when the nurse returned. "He's stable," she said, "but we need to run some tests. His vitals are fluctuating." "Can I see him?" Paul asked. "Soon," she replied, "but we need a bit more information first. Do you have any medical records, family history?" Paul shook his head. His mother, she died. Her sister gave him to me. I don't know his full medical background. The nurse gave a tight smile. "Okay, we'll do what we can. Just stay close." She walked away, and Paul was alone again. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was just after 4. The waiting room was still empty. Across from him, Maria sat quietly, coat draped over her shoulders, eyes red-rimmed. "I'm sorry," Paul said softly, "for waking you. For everything." Maria looked at him, and for the first time that night there was no hesitation in her eyes. "You did what a father's supposed to do," she said. "You ran." Paul nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything left to say. He just waited and hoped. The hallway remained quiet, but behind one of those doors, a child was breathing alive for now, because a man who had nothing, not insurance, not a car, not even legal custody on paper, had refused to let him die. He had carried him into the night and knocked on a door that almost didn't open. And that was how it all began. Not with a court order, not with a DNA test, just a knock, a cry for help, and a man who answered it. Paul had not moved from the hospital bench since the nurses had taken Joseph into the treatment room. The adrenaline from the emergency was slowly draining out of him, leaving behind an exhausted, aching stillness. His elbows rested on his knees, fingers locked tightly, and his eyes were fixed on the swinging doors Joseph had disappeared behind. The waiting room was quiet now. Maria had gone home. The hallway clock ticked evenly, indifferent to the life hanging in limbo just a few feet away. In his pocket, Paul felt the folded edge of a tattered manila envelope. He pulled it out slowly. Inside were the only documents he had ever received about Joseph: crumpled forms, a barely legible photocopy of a birth certificate, and a note that never left his mind. 3 years earlier, this all began with the hum of an engine and the smell of oil in the air. Paul had been under the hood of a rusted-out Buick in the back lot of a small rented garage. He was still piecing his life together then. After the engagement had ended, after he lost the repair job at the dealership, he had opened a small shop with nothing but a borrowed socket set and a used jack. That day had been hot. He remembered wiping sweat from his brow with a dirty rag when he heard footsteps on the gravel. He looked up and saw a woman standing just past the chain-link gate. She was holding the hand of a little boy who looked no older than 2. She didn't introduce herself at first. She didn't smile. There was something in her eyes, fatigue maybe, but also a tightness, like she was holding in more than she could carry. The boy coughed once, a dry rasp that made Paul stand upright. He walked over slowly, instinctively, unsure if she was lost or needed help with a car. But before he could speak, she said something that stopped him cold. "I know you don't know me, and I don't expect anything. I don't know where else to go." Paul stared at her, confused. Do you need something? A phone? You okay?" The woman shook her head. "This is Joseph. He's 2. He needs someone who can take care of him. Someone better than me." He blinked. "Wait, what are you saying?" She looked at the boy, then back at Paul. Her mouth trembled, but her eyes stayed hard, like they had already made peace with the choice. "You don't need to know everything. I don't want anything from you. I've seen the way you helped Naomi once. She trusted you. That's enough for me." The name hit Paul like a punch to the chest. Naomi. His little sister. He hadn't heard from her in years, but he didn't get a chance to ask more. The woman Jenna, as she would later write on the note, reached into a worn canvas bag and handed him the envelope, now sitting in his hands. "He's got asthma. Needs his meds twice a day. The instructions are in there." "Hold on," Paul said, raising a hand. "Where's his mother? Is she okay? Is this, are you telling me she's—" Jenna hesitated, her eyes darting to the boy. For a second, something in her expression cracked. Pain. Regret. Then it was gone. She shook her head slowly, but said nothing more. Instead, she bent down, kissed the top of Joseph's head, and whispered something Paul couldn't hear. She stood up. "I'm not coming back. You don't have to do this. But if you do, thank you." And then she walked away. Paul didn't sleep that night. Joseph fell asleep on an old recliner in the corner of the shop. Paul sat nearby in silence, staring at the envelope, wondering what kind of person just handed over a child to a stranger. But the boy had coughed in his sleep, whimpered once, and reached out blindly for something to hold. Paul let the small hand wrap around one of his fingers, and something in him shifted. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't even conscious. It just happened. In the morning, Paul made eggs and toast. Joseph barely ate, but he sat at the table looking around with wide, quiet eyes. Paul didn't call child services. He didn't take Joseph to a police station. He just stayed. Day after day, week after week, he learned how to be a father, not because he had planned to, but because no one else was going to do it. He learned how to dose inhalers, how to soothe night terrors, how to fix a busted toy with duct tape. He learned how to read stories aloud without fumbling, how to fold tiny socks, how to hide his fear every time Joseph had trouble breathing. And through it all, he never once heard from Jenna again. Now, 3 years later, Paul sat in that sterile hospital hallway, holding the same envelope, reading the same words. His name was nowhere on Joseph's birth certificate. There was no adoption file, no custody paperwork. Just a man, a boy, and a quiet understanding between them. The nurse returned clipboard in hand. She smiled faintly. "He's resting now. You can go in, but just for a minute." Paul stood slowly, knees stiff. He followed her down the hallway to a small room with a dim light. Joseph lay on the bed pale, but breathing steadily. There was an oxygen mask over his face and an IV in his arm. Paul sat beside the bed and reached for the boy's hand. It was warm. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." The nurse waited at the door. "Do you have any idea about his family medical history? Anything genetic?" Paul looked at her and hesitated. "No, not really. I wish I did." She nodded. "Okay, we'll keep monitoring him. We'll let you know if anything changes." Paul stayed a while longer, listening to the soft hum of the machines. Outside, the sky had begun to brighten. A new day had started, and with it the same quiet truth. He didn't know where Joseph came from, but he knew exactly where he belonged. Paul sat in the hospital room long after the nurse left, his hand still wrapped around Joseph's tiny fingers. The boy's breathing was steadier now, but the tubes and machines surrounding him made everything feel fragile, too dependent on electricity and time. The envelope rested on Paul's lap like a weight that had aged 3 years inside his pocket. He glanced toward the hallway as the sound of footsteps approached, heels steady, confident, but not rushed. He turned his head slowly, expecting another nurse or an administrator with more questions about insurance or guardianship. What he saw instead made his breath catch. Dr. Catherine Griffith stood just past the doorway, her white coat buttoned neatly, a tablet in one hand, and her eyes locked onto Joseph. She didn't see Paul at first. Her focus was on the child scanning monitors, reading vitals off a screen. Then, almost instinctively, she looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, neither spoke. The room wasn't silent because of protocol or manners. It was silent because the air between them had gone still. Catherine's mouth opened slightly, her grip tightening on the tablet. Paul stood slowly, his body tensing, unsure whether to move forward or speak first. The 7 years that had passed didn't vanish, but they folded into a kind of stunned pause neither of them knew how to navigate. "Paul," she said, finally, voice soft but steady. "Catherine," he answered, just as quiet. She glanced at Joseph again, then back to Paul. "I wasn't expecting—" Her voice trailed off. "He's your son." Paul hesitated. He's my boy." She nodded, a mixture of surprise and something unreadable crossing her face. "I'm his attending tonight. I didn't know until I saw the name." Paul took a breath, tried to stay calm. He had a seizure. "I couldn't get him to wake up. No insurance, no car. I had to get help from a neighbor. I thought I was going to lose him." Catherine stepped closer to the bed. She adjusted the oxygen mask slightly, then looked at the chart again. "He's stable now. That's the good news. But I noticed something during intake. I want to run a few more tests just to be sure." Paul watched her closely. What kind of tests? His immune system might be compromised. Some of the symptoms he's showing, they're not typical for a child his age. "I saw a birthmark on the back of his neck, shaped like a star." Paul blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah, it's always been there. Means something." She didn't answer right away. Her mind was racing through old case notes, lectures, and memories. Then she asked carefully, "Do you know anything about his biological family? Any history of genetic disorders?" Paul shook his head. "No, I never met his mother. She left him with me and disappeared. Said she trusted me. That's all." Catherine's brows furrowed. "You don't know who she was?" "No," Paul replied. "She didn't tell me. Just handed me a few papers and a note. It wasn't legal, but I couldn't turn him away." She looked at him again, this time longer, deeper. Her eyes softened a fraction, and for a brief second the room felt heavier with all the things unsaid between them. Catherine turned back to Joseph and gently pulled the blanket up around his shoulders. Paul studied her movements. They were clinical practiced, but not cold. She was still the woman who once fixed a dislocated finger on a stray dog behind the old auto shop because it was the right thing to do. Still the same, but older guarded. "How have you been?" he asked quietly. Catherine didn't look up. "Busy. Long nights. Tough patients. You know how it is." He nodded. "I've been working, fixing engines, taking care of him." She finally met his gaze again. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again. I didn't think you wanted to." There it was, the weight of what had been, the unanswered letters, the silence. Paul felt the sting in his chest, but he pushed it down. This wasn't the time. Not with Joseph still lying there, not with a dozen questions circling between them. "I'll run the panels tonight," Catherine said. "If there's anything serious, I'll let you know immediately." Paul nodded. "Thanks." She lingered a moment longer, then turned and left her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Paul sank back into the chair beside the bed. He looked at Joseph, then at the door, and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Catherine, after all these years, after all that pain, and now she might be the only one who could help save his son. It was nearly dawn when Paul left Joseph's room for the first time in hours, his feet dragging down the sterile hallway toward the vending machine near the waiting area. The hospital was quiet except for the hum of machines and the occasional intercom page. As he waited for the coffee to dispense, something flickered at the edge of his mind, a face, a moment, a truth he had spent years trying to understand. Catherine had reappeared like a ghost that refused to stay buried. Seeing her again had cracked something open. Not anger, not pain, something heavier, unfinished grief. Not just for the relationship they lost, but for the truth that had never been told. He sat on a bench by the window, cup in hand, staring at the parking lot lights shimmering in the early morning mist. He remembered the garage on Birch Avenue the way the light hit her face when she laughed. 7 years ago, they were different people. She was still in med school, then pulled between textbooks and pressure from her family. He was rebuilding carburetors by day and studying for the certification test at night. They had met when she brought in a rusted-out Subaru she couldn't afford to replace. She stayed in the waiting area, asked questions, listened to him explain the parts, not with impatience, but with curiosity. That was the beginning. For months, they lived in a quiet, secret rhythm. She would come after her shift, still in scrubs, smelling faintly of antiseptic and citrus shampoo. He'd clear space in the corner of the shop, play old soul records while they shared takeout on a workbench. She talked about wanting to practice medicine differently, less insurance, more humanity. He talked about opening a place where kids could learn to fix things instead of getting into trouble. For a while it felt possible, but her father never approved. Dr. Charles Griffiths, prominent surgeon trustee of half the boards in the county, had built a reputation on discipline status and control. Paul had only met him once. It was enough. The man shook his hand without looking him in the eye, then dismissed him with a comment about wasting potential on blue collars. Catherine tried to defend their relationship, but each visit home left her more distant. He never heard what was said behind those closed doors, but he saw the aftermath in her eyes, in her hesitation. It was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Paul had spent weeks planning it, every detail of the small engagement ceremony meant to reflect who they were. He fixed up the garage's back room with string lights and hand-sanded wooden tables. He borrowed old vinyl records from a friend, ordered her favorite flowers, white gardenias, and even asked Maria, the neighbor, who made the best tamales on the block, to cater. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, and that meant everything. He wore his only suit, the one he saved for job interviews and funerals, and stood at the front of the room waiting. At first, he thought she was just late. Catherine was always caught up at the hospital, a last-minute patient, a surgery that ran long. But the minutes turned to hours, and the music looped for the third time, and still, no Catherine. Friends started whispering. Maria brought him a plate of food that went untouched. By midnight, he was alone in the room, still standing still, hoping. He returned the next day, still wearing the same suit, crumpled now, his tie loose around his neck. He stood by the door from sunrise to sundown, a quiet defiance against reality. No call, no message, no sign of her. On the second night, he drove to the apartment they had picked together. It was empty. He knocked on neighbors' doors, asked around, but no one had seen her. Finally, with nowhere else to turn, he went to the Griffiths' estate. The butler didn't let him pass the front gate. He said only one sentence delivered with the cool detachment of someone trained to erase humanity from his tone. Miss Griffiths has returned home and will no longer be available for contact. Paul drove home in silence, hands clenched so tightly on the wheel that his knuckles ached. For weeks, he spiraled, replaying every conversation, every smile, every promise. None of it made sense. None of it felt like her. She loved him. She chose him. And then she was gone. But Catherine had disappeared for a reason she never told. The night before their engagement, she received a thick envelope from a courier. There was no sender listed, but the contents inside hit like a blow to the chest. A series of photographs, grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Paul seated on the back steps of his house, holding a thin, pale woman in his arms. Her head rested on his shoulder, eyes closed the way a lover might lean into someone trusted. The woman's hair was tangled, her arms too thin, her skin unhealthy. She looked like someone barely hanging on. And Paul, he didn't look surprised or resistant. He looked familiar with her, comfortable. Catherine stared at the photos for what felt like hours. She tried to tell herself there was an explanation, but the timing was brutal. Her father had warned her. So had David Johnson, who often looked out for the family. They had said it from the beginning. Paul was charming, but unreliable, charismatic, but dangerous in the ways that hurt quietly. She wanted to believe differently, but in that moment, all she could hear were their voices. The woman in the photo looked like someone from the streets, maybe from his past, maybe from his present. Catherine felt betrayed in a way that burned through every defense she'd built. She didn't wait. She didn't call. She packed a small bag and left before dawn. Her father sent a car. She didn't even tell her residency supervisor why she was quitting. She just left, and once she was home, the silence grew heavier. She didn't respond to Paul's letters. She didn't open most of them. She couldn't bear to see his handwriting. The pain felt too raw, too humiliating. She believed for years that she had narrowly escaped disaster, but she was wrong. And deep down somewhere she didn't admit, she knew she had run from something real, not something dangerous. She had walked away from the one man who stood beside her, not because he failed her, but because someone made her doubt him at the perfect moment. The very night he had been preparing to ask her to stay forever, she was slipping away, carrying a false story etched in photographs that had been curated to destroy what they had. Back in the hospital, as she stood over Joseph's chart, that memory came rushing back, sharp, painful, and soaked in regret. And for the first time in years, she let herself feel the weight of what she had lost. She didn't cry, not yet, but something cracked in her chest. Because now, looking at the little boy with Paul's eyes and that strange familiar birthmark, she wasn't just remembering what had been lost. She was beginning to understand just how much of it had been stolen. If the timelines matched, and if Naomi Thompson was who she now suspected her to be, then Joseph wasn't just any patient. 1,000 thoughts screamed for attention in Catherine's mind. Why hadn't anyone looked into this? Why was the file closed so quickly? Why was Naomi left to die anonymously while her child disappeared into the system? And more urgently, who had taken that child? Who had decided where he ended up? Catherine stood and looked at Linda. I need to get access to the hospital records from 7 years ago. Naomi's case, file the delivery logs, anything that wasn't purged. Linda's eyes narrowed. You're not going to find it in the main system. Someone scrubbed that one deep. But I keep a copy of old logbooks in my locker, just in case someone ever tried to rewrite history. Catherine's breath caught. You do. Call me paranoid, Linda said with a small smile, or just someone who's seen too many good people disappear into paperwork. She left to retrieve the books. Catherine leaned against the break room table, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't fully understand how or why, but she knew she was on the edge of something enormous, something that had taken a mother hidden a child and left a man raising a nephew he didn't know was blood. And more than that, she knew this wouldn't be easy to unravel. Someone had covered it up. Someone had made sure Naomi and her baby slipped through the cracks. And now that Joseph's identity was surfacing, she had a sinking feeling that whoever did it might come back to bury the truth once more. But not this time. This time, Catherine was going to find every piece of the puzzle, and she was going to fight for the boy who never should have been lost. The next morning came not with peace, but with paperwork. Paul had just arrived at the hospital, Joseph's favorite little race car clutched in his hand, when the front desk called his name. Sir, there's someone asking to meet with you privately. He says it's regarding guardianship. The phrase made Paul pause. Not doctor, not social worker. Guardianship was a word thick with implications, and it wasn't one he'd expected to hear out loud. The man was waiting in the side hallway, near the family conference rooms, a tall figure in a pressed navy suit shoes that looked like they'd never touched unpaved ground, and the kind of briefcase that said, "More about money than about care." His hair was perfectly parted, his tie understated but expensive, and his gaze, when it met Paul's, was as rehearsed as it was judgmental. "Mr. Bennett," the man said, extending a hand with just enough grip to communicate ownership, not respect. "David Johnson, Office of Youth and Protective Services contracted legal oversight for private family review matters." Paul didn't take the handshake. David cleared his throat and smiled slightly. "I'd like to have a word about the boy. Joseph." Paul's chest tightened. "He's sick. I don't think this is the time." "Actually, Mr. Bennett," David said, pulling a file from his briefcase, "it's exactly the time. You see, Joseph's legal documentation has come under routine review, and there appear to be significant irregularities. In short, there's no formal adoption trail, no state-verified guardianship records, and no listed next-of-kin approvals from any family member of origin." Paul's voice stayed steady, but his heart was beginning to race. "He's been with me for almost 3 years. Yes, I see that. But duration of care, while admirable, does not supersede legality. It seems the woman who left him in your care, a Miss Jenna Collins, had no formal authority to transfer custody. Her connection to the child remains vague at best. Do you have notarized transfer forms, medical consent agreements, any state-filed guardianship decrees?" Paul didn't answer. David didn't wait. "You see, Mr. Bennett, this isn't about intentions. I'm sure you've done your best. But Joseph is a vulnerable child from uncertain origins, and under state policy, we have an obligation to ensure he's placed in a home with proper legal and emotional infrastructure, structured stability, financial transparency, that sort of thing." There it was. The polite way of saying, "You're not fit." The implication sat like rust in the air. Paul looked David directly in the eyes. "So what happens now?" David smiled again, that same condescending stretch of lips. "For now, a preliminary investigation. No need to be alarmed. But if we don't receive satisfactory documentation within 5 business days, Joseph will be placed in protective interim housing pending further assessment. I'm sure you understand?" Paul did not understand, but he understood enough to feel the weight behind the words. The man wasn't offering a process. He was issuing a warning. "May I see Joseph?" David asked casually. "No," Paul said. That wasn't a request, David replied, though he did not press. He closed his briefcase with a snap and slid a business card across the nearby table. "I'll be following up. Please do your best to find any supporting materials. You'll want to make this transition as smooth as possible for the boy's sake." He walked away with the calm of a man who never worried about consequences. Paul stood still for a long time. The card untouched the heat of fury rising slowly in his chest. He felt the old knot return tight and familiar where dignity and fear wrestled with each other in the hollow of his stomach. He turned and headed toward Joseph's room, but not before texting Catherine. "Something's happening. I need to talk." Catherine arrived 20 minutes later, still in scrubs, her face sharp with concern. "He came to me first," she said before Paul could explain. "David Johnson. I've seen him around policy boards. Private investigator, technically, but mostly he's hired to find weaknesses in systems people want to disrupt." "You mean people like us?" Paul said bitterly. "He has ties to my father," Catherine added. "Years ago, he showed me something. It's how I—" She didn't finish the sentence. Paul didn't need her to. They sat in a quiet room behind the ICU wing documents spread between them. Catherine reviewed what little Jenna had left behind. The birth certificate unsigned by any legal authority, a generic guardianship letter with a typed signature, medical logs scribbled with emergency custody in the margins. Nothing was official. Nothing would stand in court. "They'll take him," Paul said. "Won't they?" Catherine's voice was low but clear. "Not if I have anything to say about it." "But you're not his mother. You're not even family." "I'm his doctor," she said, "and I can be more than that." Paul's eyes searched hers. "Are you doing this because of what we had? I'm doing this." She replied, "Because of what we both lost, and what we might still save." They didn't speak for a while after that, just sat, the hum of the hallway outside barely masking the tension between them. That night after Johnson left the hospital with his cryptic warning and heavy silence, Linda pulled Catherine aside in the hallway. The overhead lights flickered faintly, as if reacting to the tension lingering in the air. "I know that man," Linda said, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was listening. "Johnson. He's been involved in more than a few shady transitions. Kids from troubled backgrounds quietly moved to families who fit better. Paperwork done behind doors. Always legal, never right. Catherine's heart skipped. Her throat tightened. Was he around when Naomi came in? I don't remember seeing him directly, Linda said, eyes narrowing in thought. But I do remember how fast her file disappeared. 1 minute she was listed under observation, the next, poof. No chart, no record, just a death certificate with no baby logged. Catherine didn't respond. She didn't need to. The pieces were falling into place too fast, too darkly. She glanced at the door to Joseph's room. Something bigger had always been circling this child. Jenna Naomi, now Johnson. And she couldn't ignore it anymore. Meanwhile, across town, Paul stepped through the front door of his apartment. He carried Joseph in his arms, the boy's fever-dampened curls sticking to his forehead. The living room was dim, only a small lamp in the corner casting a circle of yellow light. Paul gently placed Joseph on the couch and pulled the blanket up to his chin. His breathing was still uneven, lips dry, but he no longer shivered violently. Paul walked to the kitchen and stopped. His eyes landed on the counter where Jenna had placed Joseph 3 years ago. No bags, no bottle, just a quiet, exhausted woman saying, "He needs you, and you're the only one I trust." He hadn't asked questions then. He had only known she was desperate and afraid. Now, after what he saw in Johnson's demeanor, after the things Catherine and Linda revealed, he wondered if Jenna had been fleeing something much larger, something not just cruel, but organized. The next morning, Catherine arrived early. Her white coat looked sharper than usual, pressed and buttoned tightly as if it were armor. She barely said good morning to the nurses before heading straight into Joseph's room. Paul was sitting beside the bed, eyes bloodshot. "He didn't sleep much," he said. "Neither did I." Catherine nodded, checked the monitors, took in the child's color, the spread of the rash. His vitals had plateaued, but not improved. "He's not getting worse," she murmured, "but he's not getting better either." Paul's voice was low. "So what now?" Catherine hesitated, then closed the door behind her. She turned back to him with a quiet determination. "There's something I need to tell you, and it's not part of the hospital's official protocol." Paul raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. "I helped develop a treatment protocol for children with similar immune responses while working on a research team in Oregon. It's based on a genomic profile match, a tailored antibody cocktail. It's still in the trial phase, not FDA approved, not authorized here. But it works. I've seen it work." She paused, letting that land. "If I administer it without clearance, I could lose my license. I could be sued. But if I don't," Paul finished her sentence, "he might not make it." She nodded. "Exactly." Paul looked at Joseph for a long time. The boy whimpered slightly in his sleep. Paul stepped closer, brushing hair from his forehead. Then he looked up at Catherine. "Do it." She blinked. "You're sure I've got nothing more to lose," he said, "but he's got everything to gain." Catherine turned and left without another word. She found Linda in the nurse's break room, told her what she needed. Linda didn't hesitate. "You get the serum ready. I'll cover the chart." That night, long after the administrative staff had gone home, Catherine slipped into the basement level of the hospital. The research wing was locked, but not to her badge. She still had clearance. Inside, she retrieved the small vial from a private storage unit where she kept reference samples from Oregon. Technically illegal to transport, certainly illegal to use. The serum shimmered faintly in the sterile lab light. She checked the label twice, then prepped the dosage. Every part of her training screamed not to move forward, but another part, older, more primal, told her to act. She carried the vial upstairs. Linda met her in the hallway. They entered Joseph's room together. Paul stood when they came in. "What do I do?" he asked. Catherine looked at him. "You hold his hand. And don't let go." She cleaned the IV port and inserted the needle. Joseph stirred, winced. Paul leaned close. "I'm here, buddy." "You're okay." The serum entered his bloodstream silently. At first, nothing happened. Then, as Catherine warned, his body began to tremble. It was subtle at first, then more intense. His pulse jumped. Alarms on the monitors flickered. Paul's panic was immediate. "He's shaking. What's happening?" Catherine remained calm, but firm. "This is the cytokine response. His immune system is resetting. We just have to ride it out." Linda was at the monitors adjusting thresholds, overriding alerts. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Then the tremors began to subside. Joseph's heart rate steadied. His oxygen climbed. The inflammation around his eyes began to recede. Paul's hand tightened around Joseph's. "You did it. No, Catherine said softly. We did. Hours passed. Paul refused to leave. Catherine dozed briefly in the chair beside the bed. Linda stayed until her shift ended, then quietly left without saying goodbye, as if afraid to break the fragile miracle they had just witnessed. As dawn painted the sky pale blue, Joseph stirred and whispered something that only Paul could hear. The man smiled, tears slipping down his face. Catherine turned toward the window, unsure if what she felt was pride, or guilt, or simply exhaustion. But one thing she did feel was certainty. They were in the fight now, against a man with power, against a system that claimed legal righteousness, against a mistake that had nearly cost a child's life. And for once, she wasn't standing on the outside watching it unfold. She was in it, all the way. The morning sky loomed dull and colorless as Catherine sat in her parked car staring at the grand facade of the Griffiths estate. Her breath fogged the windshield, but she didn't wipe it away. For the first time in years, she didn't know how to walk through that front door. The place was as immaculate as ever. White columns, trimmed hedges, the American flag gently flapping in the breeze. But it had never felt more foreign. This was the home that had praised her degrees, boasted about her future, and quietly, skillfully dismantled the love she once believed unshakable. When she finally moved, it was mechanical. Up the walkway, through the front door, down the hallway, lined with carefully framed portraits of ancestors who had likely never welcomed anyone like Paul into their bloodline. Her father wasn't home. That was a relief. She didn't want to see the man who had ruined everything, not yet. The key to his study was right where it had always been hidden, in the third drawer of the side table near the staircase. Her hand hesitated before pulling it out. Then she unlocked the door. The study smelled like cedar and ego. Everything in it was perfectly aligned books by height plaques spaced evenly, no room for anything uncertain. She moved behind the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and there, wedged under a folder labeled Legal Affairs, was a cardboard box tied with ivory ribbon, her name in her mother's cursive across the top. She brought it to the desk. Her fingers were trembling. Untied the ribbon, opened the box. Dozens of letters, all from Paul. She picked the first one up, dated the week she vanished from his life. Dear Catherine, I waited for you at the restaurant, then at your apartment, then at the hospital, for 2 days. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just thought, maybe something happened. Something terrible. But when I saw your father, he didn't even pretend. He just said you'd come to your senses, that you were better off. That broke me more than I knew possible. Tears blurred the ink. Her breath hitched as she flipped through them. There was no bitterness in his words, no hate, just confusion, hurt, a slow unraveling of hope. He had written every few weeks for nearly a year, then less often, but he never stopped. One letter told of Naomi, his sister, addicted, homeless. The woman in the photograph her father had shown her, the woman Paul was hugging, wasn't a secret lover. It was Naomi, halfway through withdrawal, held up by the only family who hadn't abandoned her. The last letter was unfinished. If you ever read this, I need you to know I never lied, never cheated. I only wanted to build something real with you. I still do. Catherine folded forward arms, cradling her head as sobs tore through her. The photo, the lies, the silence, all of it had stolen years she couldn't get back. She had believed the worst about the man she loved because it was easier than confronting the truth about the people who raised her. She didn't know how long she sat there. Time had gone soft. Eventually she heard a soft knock at the doorframe. Her mother. You found them, her mother said quietly, eyes rimmed in guilt but lips too proud to shake. You let him think I abandoned him, Catherine whispered. You let me believe he betrayed me. We protected you, her mother said. You had a future. He didn't belong in our world. No, Catherine said as she stood. He was the only one who ever told me the truth, and I threw him away for it. She didn't wait for a reply. She clutched the letters and walked out past the white columns, the trimmed hedges, and the ghosts of every lie they ever built. By late afternoon, her car pulled up in front of Paul's building. She didn't knock right away. She sat in the car, rereading the unfinished letter, pressing it to her chest. Her fingers trembled on the steering wheel. Then she stepped out and crossed the sidewalk, her heart hammering louder with every step. The door opened before she could knock twice. Paul stood there holding Joseph's dinosaur cup in one hand, a dish rag slung over his shoulder. He looked at her like someone watching a storm come back after the sun. I need to talk to you, she said, voice breaking. He didn't say anything, but he didn't close the door. I found the letters, she whispered, all of them. I know the truth. About Naomi. About that photo. About why you waited." Paul's jaw tensed. His eyes, dark and guarded, scanned her face like he couldn't decide whether to let hope rise again or bury it for good. "I left you," Catherine said. "I let them fill my head with lies. I let them erase what we had because I was afraid to question them. But I know now. You never gave up, even when I did." She pulled the unfinished letter from her pocket, unfolded it with shaking hands. "You wrote this," she said, "on the day I was supposed to become your fiancé." His eyes flinched. A moment passed, then another. "I waited 2 days," he said quietly. "I sat in that diner watching the door. I thought maybe you'd been in an accident. I thought maybe your father locked you away. I never thought. You just didn't believe me." "I wanted to," she said. "I did, but I didn't fight for you. I didn't fight for us." Paul looked down at the letter, at her hands, at the pain she was trying not to drown in. Finally, his voice broke through. "Why are you here, Catherine?" "To make things right," she said. "To stand beside you this time and fight for Joseph, for Naomi, for you." He stepped aside, and this time she walked in, not as a doctor, not as a woman who left, but as the woman who had finally come home. The next morning came with a sky washed in gray, the kind of color that makes people walk slower and think harder. Catherine hadn't slept. Her thoughts kept circling the same names, the same faces: Naomi, Paul, Joseph, Jenna, and David Johnson. She couldn't shake the feeling that the final piece of the truth was still hiding somewhere between the words people had chosen not to say. So she drove. Back to the hospital, back to the records, and finally back to the woman who had never let her down, Linda. Linda was already in early, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She looked up, saw the storm in Catherine's expression, and said nothing, just nodded toward the archive room. Catherine went in alone. She combed through physical files, not the digital records Johnson could manipulate, actual ink-on-paper charts, handwritten intake notes, nurse observations. After an hour, she found it a thin, faded folder labeled Naomi T. Inside was a photo ID stapled to the intake form. Catherine froze. The eyes, the sharp cheekbones, the tired, distant gaze. She recognized her. It was the same woman from the photo David Johnson had shown her all those years ago, the one that had shattered her faith in Paul, that had driven her out of his life. Catherine sat down hard. The next page was a birth record: one premature baby boy mother deceased during labor, no known next of kin, child placed in temporary custody case closed without formal adoption due to a clerical delay. Joseph. She whispered his name and felt the weight of it. This Naomi wasn't just any woman. This Naomi was Naomi Thompson, Paul's sister, the one he had written about in the letters, the one who had disappeared, the one Jenna had spoken about with a broken voice but no details. Now it all made sense. The woman in the photograph wasn't a secret lover. She was family. Paul hadn't lied. He had been trying to protect someone who had already been lost. Catherine closed the folder and hugged it to her chest. That afternoon she called Paul. He answered on the third ring, voice low, cautious. "Hey, I need to see you," she said. "Now. It's about Joseph and Naomi." There was silence. Then he said, "Come by." She arrived with the folder still in her hands, her mind rehearsing every word, every moment she had misjudged him, every lie she had believed. Paul opened the door, eyes tired but calm. Joseph was playing quietly in the back room, humming to himself. Catherine didn't wait. "She was your sister, Naomi Thompson, the woman in the photo." Paul stiffened. "I found her file. She gave birth here. She died here." He didn't speak. Catherine's voice trembled. "Joseph is your nephew." Paul closed his eyes, and for the first time in years allowed the tears to come. He sank into the nearest chair. "I always suspected," he said finally, "but no one ever confirmed it. Jenna wouldn't tell me. I only knew she was in trouble, and then she was gone. I thought I'd failed her." "You didn't," Catherine said. "They did. Johnson, my father, the system." She placed the folder on the table between them. "We can prove it now. His bloodline, your guardianship, everything." Paul looked at her, his eyes filled with something between exhaustion and renewed hope. "You still believe me?" "I believe you more than anyone," she said. That afternoon they made calls. Catherine contacted the hospital board. Linda gathered the relevant patient files she had quietly made copies of over the years, those she had always felt uneasy about, but had never dared question aloud. Paul compiled his documentation photos of Joseph through the years' medical receipts, the school forms he had filled out, and the consistent witness of a life shared and built in love, not legality. The hearing was set for 3 days later. It would be an internal review held in the hospital conference room. It wasn't a court of law, but in the world of reputations and ethical oversight, it was no less powerful. When they walked into the room that Friday morning, the atmosphere was thick with polished silence. A panel of 5 individuals sat on one side of a long mahogany table, administrators, legal consultants, and one ethics officer. David Johnson was already there, seated to the right, dressed in a navy suit that looked as expensive as it did smug. He barely glanced at Catherine or Paul when they entered. Catherine began. Her voice was steady but laced with urgency. She laid out the timeline of Naomi's admission, the mysterious disappearance of her file, the matching birthmark on Joseph, the genetic profile that pointed to the same autoimmune markers. Then she presented the letters. These were kept from me, all of them. Letters that could have changed everything. Letters that prove Mr. Bennett was not a liar, not a manipulator, but a man who was doing everything he could to save someone who needed help. Linda took the floor next. She wasn't polished or trained for public speaking, but her words carried the weight of time and decency. She spoke of the unusual patterns she noticed with certain cases, young mothers marked as unstable children, transferred with suspicious speed documentation, pushed through channels not usually used. I didn't say anything for years. I thought it was above my pay grade, but now I know what silence costs. I won't stay silent anymore. Then Paul stood up. He didn't have notes. He didn't need any. He looked straight at the panel, then at Johnson. 3 years ago, a woman came to my door with a baby. She didn't give me a reason, just trust. I didn't have a manual. I didn't have a plan. I had a crib I built myself and a heart that didn't know how to turn away. And every night since I've fed him, bathed him, sat beside him through nightmares and doctor visits and school tests. You can say I'm not his father by paper, but tell me who's been there for him every single day, who has earned the right to be called Dad. The room was quiet. Then Johnson spoke. His tone was cold practiced. This man is emotionally involved. That much is clear. But the fact remains that he was in possession of a child without legal guardianship. We cannot let sentiment override safety. Catherine leaned forward. And who made that guardianship illegal in the first place? Who signed off on the fake documents? She handed over the copied forms. Johnson's signature was there, undeniable. The panel murmured among themselves. One member asked if Johnson had anything to say. He shifted uncomfortably. Those forms were vetted through proper channels. I was only following procedure. But it was too late. The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer about uncertainty. It was about recognition, a recognition that the system had failed and someone had made sure it would. They adjourned the meeting without conclusion, but the damage was done. Johnson was placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. Paul and Catherine walked out into the cold air, breath-visible hearts racing. "What now?" Paul asked. "Now," Catherine said, "we take this to court, and this time with everything on our side." They didn't hold hands. They didn't cry. But something between them had shifted again, not back to what was, but towards something rebuilt. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a cold, pale sun breaking through the fog. Paul stood outside the courthouse in a dark suit that fit just a little too tightly across the shoulders, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. Catherine stood beside him, holding a leather folder filled with every scrap of evidence they had gathered: Naomi's medical file, Linda's statement copies of the forged adoption papers, and most importantly, proof of Paul's unwavering commitment to the child he'd raised. The courtroom wasn't grand. It had gray carpet fluorescent lighting and a quiet that pressed against the skin. But the weight in the room was heavy with meaning. At one side sat David Johnson, flanked by his legal counsel. He looked smaller than he had at the hospital hearing, as if the cracks had finally begun to show. On the other side were Paul, Catherine, and their attorney. The judge was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a calm demeanor. She listened more than she spoke, and that Catherine had told Paul was a good sign. Catherine was first to speak. She detailed Naomi's admission 3 years prior, the birth complications, her sudden death, and the disappearance of her file from hospital records. She clarified now for the court why Naomi and Paul bore different last names. Their parents had divorced when they were young. Naomi had taken their mother's surname and ended up in the foster system after years of instability. They saw each other only once as adults, briefly at the rehab center, where Paul had volunteered as a community mechanic for outreach. She hadn't told him she was pregnant. When Naomi died during childbirth, Catherine said, voice firm but soft, there was no next of kin listed, no father's name, but her son was alive, alone, and vulnerable. Linda took the stand next. Her Her presence wasn't polished, but her sincerity made the courtroom lean in. She described her unease at how Naomi's chart had vanished so quickly, how it wasn't the first time she'd seen such things happen. They came in, looked at her file, and within 2 days it was gone. No discharge report, no death certificate in the hospital system. I'd seen Johnson involved in similar cases, always with young women from unstable backgrounds. Babies moved like shadows. Paul stood. He didn't speak from notes. His voice was steady now, aged by the storms it had weathered. I didn't know Naomi had a child. When Jenna brought Joseph to my garage, I thought it was just a coincidence. I thought maybe I was doing a favor for a friend of hers. But something in me knew. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. Maybe it was just the way I couldn't say no. He paused and looked across the courtroom, locking eyes with Johnson. I was there for that boy when no one else was, through sickness, birthdays, and broken faucets. I was his dad before I ever knew I had the right to call myself that. And now, I just want the truth to count for something. The judge leaned forward slightly. And you're asking for legal guardianship on the grounds of biological relation, documented caretaking, and in the interest of the child's well-being. Yes, Your Honor, their attorney said, and we're also submitting evidence of falsified documents facilitated by Mr. Johnson, documents that misrepresented the adoption and concealed the child's true origins. When the judge recessed to deliberate, the room exhaled. It took less than an hour. When she returned, she read her decision clearly and slowly. The court recognizes Mr. Paul Bennett as the legal guardian of the minor Joseph. This decision is supported by biological relation, substantial evidence of stable and continuous care, and the recommendation of medical professionals involved in the case. Additionally, the court recommends an internal investigation into Mr. Johnson's past handling of adoption-related documentation. Paul closed his eyes, not in triumph, but in quiet, weary relief. Catherine reached over and squeezed his hand. For the first time in a long while, the world felt like it was tilting toward justice. Later that afternoon, Paul made his way to the hospital. He had asked Catherine to give him a moment alone with Joseph. The boy was recovering steadily. His fever had broken, and the autoimmune flare was finally responding to treatment. He was propped up in bed, a stack of papers and crayons spread out beside him, a green dinosaur half-colored. Paul stepped into the room. Joseph looked up and smiled, the fatigue still present in his eyes, but the brightness returning. "Hey, Dad," he said like it was the most natural thing in the world. Paul felt a tightness in his throat. "Hey, champ, what are you working on drawing us?" Joseph said. He held up a picture. 2 figures, one tall, dark-skinned with a beard, and one smaller with a crayon in each hand, stood beside a red garage. Paul sat down slowly, letting himself breathe. "That's a pretty good drawing." Joseph looked at him seriously. "Are we going to stay together forever now?" Paul nodded. "Yeah, buddy. No more what-ifs, no more waiting. It's just us now. Always." Joseph reached over and hugged him, his small arms around Paul's neck. And in that moment, the hospital room faded away. The pain, the battles, the lies, they were still there, but behind them now. Paul held his nephew, his son, and finally let himself believe they had made it through. Outside, Catherine waited in the hallway. Linda stood beside her, flipping through a folder for the next report she intended to file. A nurse walked by and whispered, "You did good." Catherine didn't reply. She just smiled, closed her eyes for a second, and took a deep breath. Justice hadn't fixed everything, but for one child and one man who refused to let go, it had made all the difference. The days that followed moved slower, like the pause between heavy breaths after a long uphill run. With the court ruling behind them and Joseph finally recovering in the hospital, a strange quiet settled over Paul's world, not empty, but full of something new, stillness, safety, the absence of fear. For the first time in years, no one was knocking on his door with questions he couldn't answer, and no one was threatening to take the one thing he held dearest. But even peace comes with responsibilities. Paul walked back into his garage that Monday morning, the scent of engine oil and steel as familiar as the lines on his palms. The place looked just like it had the day before Joseph's seizure, but everything had changed. He stood for a moment under the weak morning sun, cutting through the roll-up door, listening to the clink of tools, the low whir of a car lift groaning back to life. A couple of neighborhood kids on bikes stopped at the edge of the lot to wave. One of them called, "Hey, Mr. Bennett, you gonna start up the classes again?" Paul raised a hand, smiling. "Soon." "Yeah, real soon." And he meant it. That night, he pulled the old bulletin board back into the waiting area and rewrote the hand-lettered sign with a black Sharpie-free auto skills Mondays, Wednesdays, Saturdays, no experience needed. Underneath, he added snacks provided. A few minutes later, he printed a second one and dropped it off at the community center down the street. Meanwhile, across town, Catherine was making her own return. The hospital board had cleared her of any wrongdoing in the Joseph Bennett case, though not without pointed questions about her decision to bend protocol. She'd answered every one of them clearly and without apology. When they asked if she would do it again, she said, only if the system fails a child again. Then she'd handed in her notice. 3 weeks later, with the help of a small grant and some donations, some anonymous, some not, Catherine opened a modest clinic on the edge of the neighborhood Paul called home. It wasn't fancy. The waiting chairs were mismatched, and the roof leaked when it rained hard, but the place had warmth. Linda joined as nurse supervisor, bringing with her a deep drawer of handwritten notes and files she'd copied for backup over the years. They called it Second Chance Health. A nod, Paul said, to what they'd all been given. Joseph returned home 2 weeks after the court ruling. His body still tired easily, but the smile was back in full force. He'd taken to hanging out at the clinic on the days he wasn't in school, sketching in the break room and asking Linda endless questions about the human body. He still visited the garage, too, watching Paul work on brake pads and timing belts, offering unsolicited advice, like, I think it needs more wrenching. One afternoon, Catherine came by with a small plastic box. It's a DNA kit, she explained. For Joseph, if he ever wants to see it all on paper, you don't have to do it now. Paul looked at the box in his hand for a long second, then nodded. Not yet, he said, but when he asks, we'll do it together. One night, Joseph came into the living room clutching a folded sheet of paper. Miss Linda says I can enter the school science fair. Can I do a project about genetics? Paul looked up from his coffee. Absolutely, but you'll have to explain it to me like I'm 5. Joseph grinned. I'll draw pictures. Paul laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. Deal. That same week, the first article dropped in the local paper, Hospital Whistleblower Exposes Adoption Scandal. Catherine didn't read it right away. She already knew every name in the report, but she watched as others read it, Linda's quiet pride. Paul's jaw tightening at every mention of Johnson, the way Joseph looked at the photo of Naomi and asked, did she know I'd be okay? Paul knelt down beside him. I think she hoped you would be. And she trusted the right people. Catherine came up behind them, resting a hand on Paul's shoulder. And now you can make sure she was right. Later that week, the 3 of them stood on a patch of earth in a quiet corner of the cemetery. Naomi's grave had always been unmarked, buried in paperwork and the shadows of bureaucracy. But now a simple granite headstone bore her name, and next to it a smaller one for Jenna Collins. It was Joseph's idea. She didn't do everything right, he'd said, but she kept me safe until you found me. They stood in silence, Catherine holding Joseph's hand, Paul tracing the engraved letters with one calloused finger. He whispered more to the wind than to anyone else. I'm sorry I wasn't there, but I am now. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Joseph placed a small wooden figure beside Naomi's grave. It was carved in the shape of a star. I made it in art, he said, for the birthmark. So she knows I remember. On the way back to the car, Joseph leaned into Paul's side. I think I want to fix things too, like you do. Paul smiled, his voice low. Then I'll teach you everything I know. And just like that, the road ahead felt less uncertain, still full of turns and hills and unknowns. But for once, it wasn't something Paul faced alone. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Paul, Catherine, and Joseph stood at the edge of a quiet hillside cemetery just outside the city. The ground was damp with dew, and the air carried the scent of pine and earth. A small cluster of gravestones nestled between old oak trees, some cracked and weathered with time. Paul held Joseph's hand as they stepped closer to a modest granite marker that bore the name Naomi Thompson. Fresh flowers rested at its base, their colors bright against the gray stone. Joseph looked up at Paul. Is this where she is? Paul nodded, his voice low. Yeah, buddy. This is where your mom rests. The boy was quiet for a long moment. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. He just stood still, watching the name carved in stone, as if trying to form a memory from something he'd never been allowed to know. Catherine stepped forward, placing a small wooden cross beside the flowers. There was another plaque with her not elaborate, just a simple piece of polished stone that read, Jenna Collins. She chose love over silence. Paul crouched beside Joseph and pointed. Jenna took care of you when I didn't even know you existed. She brought you to me even though it meant giving you up. That's love, too. The hard kind. Joseph whispered, Did she know Mom? Catherine answered softly, her voice full of the kind of pain that had softened into wisdom. She did. They were connected in ways we'll probably never fully understand. But both of them gave you a future, Joseph. And now it's yours. They stood there in silence, the wind rustling the trees above them. Paul finally took a deep breath and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded drawing Joseph had made at the hospital. It was the same one, him and Paul standing beside a red garage. Joseph had added Catherine now in a white coat holding a clipboard. Paul tucked the drawing into a plastic sleeve and placed it gently against Naomi's stone. He rested his hand on it for a moment. I wish we had more time, sis. I wish I could have been there for you when it mattered, but I promise you this, your son is going to grow up surrounded by people who don't just love him. They see him. That afternoon they returned home to a space that felt lighter somehow. The walls of Paul's modest house had been painted recently a soft, warm gray with white trim. Joseph's room had a new bunk bed, a bookshelf filled with science kits, and a set of tools designed for small hands. Paul had built it himself, slowly, carefully, with the kind of reverence people usually reserve for sacred spaces. In the garage out back, the old signs had been taken down. In their place was a hand-painted board, Bennett Youth Workshop. Underneath, in smaller letters, Learn, Build, Belong. That Monday, Paul held his first class for 3 teenagers from the neighborhood. One had just finished probation. Another had dropped out of school. The third didn't say much, but watched everything with quiet hunger. Paul taught them how to take apart a carburetor, but more than that, he taught them patience, accountability, and the pride in making something run again. Joseph sat nearby with a notebook, scribbling down both diagrams and notes, like it was all a puzzle he was meant to solve. Across town, Catherine opened the doors to the Griffiths Community Health Clinic. It wasn't fancy 2 exam rooms, a waiting area, and a break room, but it was open 5 days a week, walk-ins welcome, and no one turned away for lack of insurance. Linda took the role of medical records supervisor and patient advocate. She knew most people by name within a week. Some evenings, Catherine and Paul would sit on the back steps of the garage, watching Joseph play with a set of circuits Linda had given him. They didn't talk about the past much anymore, not because it didn't matter, but because they knew now that healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about building something that made the pain mean something. One evening, Paul found Joseph at the kitchen table, surrounded by open books, 2 half-finished drawings, and a laptop that blinked with blueprints. "What are you working on, champ?" Joseph looked up grinning. "A garage that runs on solar power. I want to make it real. One that helps kids like Uncle Paul helps." Paul smiled, resting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "That sounds like a good dream." Joseph shook his head. "Not a dream, a plan." A few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday, the 3 of them returned to the cemetery. This time, they brought folding chairs and sandwiches. It wasn't solemn. It wasn't ceremonial. It was just presence. Paul sat beside Naomi's grave and told her about the new students. Catherine read aloud one of Joseph's short essays titled, "What Makes a Family?" And Joseph, legs crossed, leaned against the stone with a sandwich in hand and said, "I think you would have liked science. You gave me science blood. That's what Dad says." Paul looked at Catherine, who blinked hard and smiled. When it was time to leave, Paul knelt once more. He whispered, "You didn't get to raise him, but everything good in him. It started with you and Jenna, and now it's our turn to carry it forward." As they walked back to the car, Joseph turned and looked one last time. The hill was golden with afternoon sun, the 2 grave markers side by side. "Will we come back again?" he asked. "Always," Paul replied, "because remembering is part of keeping people alive." That night, Joseph sat at the table under the warm kitchen light finishing his math homework. His laughter echoed through the house when Catherine told a corny joke, and Paul rolled his eyes before pretending to be offended. The scene was unremarkable. No confetti, no big announcements. But it was everything, because the legacy Naomi and Jenna left behind wasn't in money or reputation. It was in one boy drawing plans by lamplight, in one man fixing more than just engines, and in one woman finally choosing where she belonged. They didn't change the world, but they changed one. And for Joseph, that was more than enough. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with the story until the very end. If you're still here, It means something in this journey spoke to you, maybe a moment of courage, a quiet act of love, or the quiet endurance of those who keep going even when no one's watching. This was never just about a courtroom, or a hospital room, or a garage. It was about dignity, about truth, and about the ordinary people who make extraordinary choices in the face of injustice. People like Paul, who showed us that being present, really present, can be a form of resistance. People like Catherine, who proved that it's never too late to make things right. And people like you who choose to listen, to feel, and to remember. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. What part of this story moved you? What stayed with you after the screen faded to black? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I read them with gratitude. And if this story meant something to you, consider giving it a like or subscribing to this channel. It helps this space grow and allows more stories like this to find those who need them. Your support isn't just numbers. It's a quiet act of solidarity, a belief that compassion still matters, that truth deserves a voice, and that storytelling, honest, raw, and human, still has a place in this world. Wherever you are, thank you for choosing to be here. Until we meet again in the next story, stay kind, stay brave, and never underestimate the power of simply showing up with deep respect and appreciation. See you next time.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.